There are people in this story who chose to do evil, and there are people this story happened to. Michael Afton sits somewhere in the uncomfortable space between those two categories, which is precisely what makes him one of the most compelling, most quietly devastating characters in this entire franchise. He isn't a villain in any straightforward sense. He isn't a simple victim either. He's a person who did something unforgivable when he was young, spent what appears to be the rest of his life trying to make it right, paid for that attempt in ways that most characters in fiction never have to. By the time his story reaches its conclusion, Michael Afton has lost his brother, his sister, his own body, and eventually his father, not to reconciliation, but to fire. He is, in the most literal sense possible, a man who gave everything he had to fix damage he helped cause, and the franchise never wants him off the hook for having helped cause it in the first place. Understanding Michael's complete story requires understanding the world he was born into, because nothing about who he becomes as an adult can be properly interpreted without first understanding the household that shaped him. He grows up as the oldest child of William Afton, a man who co-founds what eventually becomes Fazbear Entertainment alongside his business partner Henry Emily. From the outside, this looks like an ordinary, even exciting family situation. Two engineers building something ambitious together, constructing animatronic mascots for a family restaurant, working with technology that genuinely pushed the boundaries of what consumer robotics could accomplish at the time. For the children growing up within this world, the workshop isn't a distant, sealed-off professional space. It's home. It's where they spend their afternoons. It's where the boundaries between toy and machine and something stranger blur in ways that a child might find wonderful without yet possessing the language to describe why it also feels slightly wrong. Michael has siblings, a younger brother whose real name the franchise has deliberately, consistently withheld across most of its mainline material, and whom the fandom has come to call the crying child based entirely on his habitual, haunting expression in the few glimpses the games provide of him, and a younger sister named Elizabeth, who has her own particular attachment to one specific piece of her father's work, an attachment that will eventually cost her everything. These three children exist within the same orbit, under the same roof, shaped by the same father, and the contrast between how each of them relates to William Afton is one of the most quietly revealing pieces of character work this franchise ever does. Elizabeth, by every indication the games provide, actually connects with William, not just tolerates him or exists alongside him the way children often do with difficult parents, but genuinely looks up to him, seeks his approval, and shares something of his fascination with the animatronic technology he builds. There is a particular machine she becomes obsessed with, one her father has repeatedly, explicitly told her to stay away from. She mentions this prohibition herself, in the only direct words she's ever given to speak in this franchise, describing how her father always told her no, how she watched other children interact with this animatronic for so long, how she finally believed she understood why it called to her. Specifically, the machine is circus baby. The prohibition, as it turns out, was the only protective William Afton ever genuinely demonstrated toward any of his children, and even that instinct failed to save Elizabeth in the end. But we'll get there. The crying child's relationship with William is considerably harder to read through the limited material available, because his story is conveyed almost entirely through the nightmare logic of Five Nights at Freddy's 4, filtered through the distorted lens of a dying child's hallucinations, rather than through any direct depiction of ordinary family life. What comes through, even through that distortion, is a child who is deeply, chronically frightened. Frightened of the animatronics, frightened of what he might find in the rooms beyond his own bedroom door. Frightened in a way that suggests the fear is not new, not situational, not simply the result of a single bad experience. He is a child who has been living with something he can't fully articulate for long enough that the fear has become his baseline. Whether this fear is connected directly to William Afton in any personal sense, whether there is something happening in that household that contributed to this child's persistent, pervasive terror, is one of the questions this franchise raises, and then, in its characteristic way, declines to fully. Afton's answer. The implication is present. The confirmation is not. And then there's Michael, the oldest, the one who should, by conventional logic, have the most stability, the most context, the most capacity to understand what's actually happening in the world around him. Instead, Michael, at the age we first encounter him in any meaningful way, is doing something genuinely cruel. Something the franchise never makes excuses for and never softens through the kind of retroactive recontextualization it applies to other morally complicated moments. He is bullying his younger brother. Actively, persistently, and in collaboration with a group of other children who seem to follow his lead. The nature of this bullying is specific rather than generic. It centers repeatedly on the animatronics his father builds, on forcing his younger brother into proximity with the very things that terrify him most. It's important to sit with this for a moment rather than moving past it quickly. Because the temptation when discussing Michael Afton in depth is to rush toward his redemptive arc, to spend most of the analysis on who, rather than being fully honest about who he starts as. He starts as a child who chooses, repeatedly, to use his brother's specific, genuine terror as a source of entertainment. He has presumably watched this brother cry and flinch and plead often enough to know exactly which threats will land hardest, and he deploys that knowledge. This isn't a single moment of poor judgment. It's an established pattern. The game's mini-sequences depicting the lead-up to the bite of 83 are plural, repetitive, showing us the same dynamic playing out across multiple instances before the one that ends in catastrophe. Why does Michael do this? The franchise doesn't give us a clean answer, and resisting the urge to invent one on its behalf matters for treating this story honestly. What we can do is observe the environment he's growing up in and ask reasonable questions about what it might produce in an oldest child. His father is William Afton, a man who, by this point in the timeline, has already demonstrated a fundamental disregard for other people's well-being at a level that goes considerably beyond anything a child would have the perspective to recognize or name. Children don't observe their parents and conclude they're monsters. They observe their parents and absorb patterns. They learn what the people around them value, what behaviors get tolerated, what cruelties pass without comment. Growing up in William Afton's household, watching how his father relates to the people and machines around him, Michael has presumably absorbed certain lessons about power, about the entertainment value of other people's distress, about what it means to be strong versus what it means to be weak, that a different household would never have taught him. This doesn't excuse what he does. The franchise is very clear that it doesn't excuse what he does, and Michael's subsequent arc makes equally clear that Michael himself eventually arrives at the same conclusion. But it contextualizes it in a way that makes him considerably more than simply a thoughtlessly cruel child and considerably more interesting as a character for it. He is, in part, a product of what was modeled for him. He is also, crucially, someone who had a choice in the matter and chose badly. Because not every child raised in a difficult household becomes the kind of person who organizes his friends into a group that corners and terrorizes his own little brother. The relationship between Michael and the crying child, whatever warmth or ordinary brotherhood it might have once contained, by the time we see it depicted in any detail, has become something significantly more painful than that. There are moments, small ones, where the games seem to suggest that Michael is not entirely indifferent to his brother's experience. A particular cutscene that fans have analyzed extensively over the years shows what appears to be Michael approaching his younger brother in a moment that reads as either comfort or threat, depending on interpretation, and the honest answer is that both interpretations remain viable given how, deliberately, the franchise frames it. The franchise doesn't fully make Michael a monster within the domestic sphere, but it also doesn't let him off the hook by making him secretly kind when nobody is watching. He occupies genuinely uncomfortable middle ground. Fredbear's Family Diner is the location that sits at the center of the Afton children's early childhood in the most direct, documented sense. This is the original establishment co-founded by William Afton and Henry Emily. considerably smaller and more personal than the pizzerias that will come later, organized around a single primary mascot lineup: a golden bear named Fredbear and a yellow rabbit costume called Spring Bonnie. These two suits are the pieces of technology that eventually shape every major event across Michael Afton's entire life, directly or indirectly, which makes understanding exactly what they are considerably more important than most newcomers initially realize. Fredbear and Spring Bonnie are spring-locked suits, a category of animatronic technology that exists, within the logic of this franchise, in a genuinely uncomfortable dual state. In one configuration, they operate as fully autonomous performers, complete animatronic endoskeletons in fabric and surface material, moving and entertaining without anyone inside them. In the other configuration, the entire endoskeleton can be mechanically compressed and held inward by a series of springs and retaining latches, creating sufficient interior space for an actual human being to climb inside and wear the suit as a costume, operating it manually rather than relying on its built-in programming. It sounds clever. It sounds like exactly the kind of ingenious dual functionality that would appeal to engineers who want maximum flexibility from their investment. What it actually is, in practical terms, is a catastrophe waiting for the right moment to arrive. Those springs and latches are never designed to accommodate a living human body inside them for any extended duration. The tolerances are thin. The conditions under which they maintain their compressed state are narrow. Any significant vibration, any unexpected moisture introduced into the interior mechanisms, any sustained weight applied in the wrong configuration, can cause the springs to release entirely without warning. When that happens with a person inside, the endoskeleton snaps back to its fully expanded performance shape without any regard for the biology now occupying that same space. The results are irreversible. The game series describes these mechanisms explicitly enough across multiple entries. No one interacting meaningfully with this story can plausibly claim to misunderstand what a spring-lock failure means in practice. The children who grow up at Fredbear's family diner, including Michael and his siblings, are presumably accustomed to these suits in the way that children become accustomed to anything that surrounds them from a very young age. Familiarity is its own kind of blindness. A suit you've seen your whole life, that performs birthday shows and poses for photographs and sits in the corner of a workshop being worked on by your father, loses its capacity to register as dangerous even when the danger is structural, fundamental, and sitting right there on the surface for anyone knew what they were looking to see. The Afton children don't know what they're looking at. William Afton presumably does, which makes the events that follow something considerably more complicated than a simple accident. Here's what happens at Fredbear's family diner on the day that ends the crying child's life and begins Michael Afton's long, ongoing reckoning with guilt. It's a birthday celebration. The crying child's birthday, specifically, which means it should be, by any ordinary measure, a day when the household's usual dynamics might soften slightly, when even a difficult family might manage to approximate warmth for a few hours. It doesn't go that way. Michael, together with several other children, corners his younger brother near the animatronic stage. The logic of the prank, if it can even be called that, is straightforward in the cruelest possible sense. They know the crying child is terrified of Fredbear. They know that proximity to the suit is something he dreads. And so they drag him toward it, hold him close to it, and then, in the specific moment that the franchise depicts with a particular quiet horror, force his head directly into Fredbear's open mouth, the way you might pose a photograph, the way children who are being careless about the line between joke and cruelty sometimes do when they've gone too far and don't quite know how to stop. The spring locks fail. Fredbear bites down. What happens next is not ambiguous, even though the franchise conveys it through implication rather than explicit graphic depiction. The injury to the crying child's skull is severe. He ends up in a hospital in a condition serious enough that medical care is required and the outcome remains uncertain. The game Five Nights at Freddy's 4, which depicts this child's experience from the inside, frames everything that follows as the fever logic of his dying consciousness. His mind replayer and isolation through the distorted architecture of nightmare versions of the animatronics that already frightened him so much during his ordinary life. The Nightmare Fredbear and the nightmare versions of the other restaurant mascots aren't monsters breaking into an actual bedroom. They're the imagery a dying brain reaches for when it tries to process the worst thing that ever happened to it. The crying child dies. Not immediately, possibly, and not on screen in any moment the franchise makes completely explicit, but the trajectory is unambiguous across everything Five Nights at Freddy's 4 shows us. He doesn't recover. This child, whose name we were never given, whose face saw primarily as a simplified expression of perpetual distress, whose relationship with his older brother was the specific wound that led to his death, does not make it out of this particular chapter of the story. Michael is responsible for this. Not uniquely, not in isolation. He had accomplices, and the spring lock mechanism was already dangerous, and the suit should never have been in a position where a child could be forced against it. But Michael organized the prank. Michael held his brother there. Michael made the specific choice that preceded the specific outcome. The franchise never lets him forget this, and in a meaningful sense, neither does he. Everything that follows across the rest of Michael Afton's life, every decision he makes, every sacrifice he eventually offers, every risk he takes in pursuit of his father, and whatever answers his father's story might provide, carries the weight of this single birthday party in some form. There's a detail worth examining here that the franchise leaves deliberately unresolved, but that several pieces of material seem to gesture toward. After the bite of 83, after his brother's death, what is Michael Afton's actual emotional experience? The franchise doesn't depict it directly. We don't see him grieve, don't see him confess to anyone, don't see whatever immediate aftermath of this event looks like from his specific perspective. He disappears from the story's documented timeline for a significant period, reappearing only as an adult, taking a job at a specific facility, for reasons that only make sense when you understand how thoroughly he's been shaped by everything that preceded that decision. But the absence of documentation isn't the same as an absence of experience. Michael presumably lives for years after this event with the full knowledge of what he did. He presumably moves through adolescence and early adulthood carrying the specific weight of having been the person who held his own brother in position for a spring lock failure that ended that brother's life. How a person carries something like that, how it changes the way they make decisions, what it does to the part of them that once organized other children to terrorize a smaller child for entertainment, these are questions the franchise raises through implication rather direct depiction. They're questions worth thinking carefully about when you're trying to understand who Michael Afton actually is when he reappears as an adult. What the franchise does make clear is that Michael doesn't simply move on, doesn't build an ordinary life entirely separate from everything connected to his family's history. He remains connected to his father's world. Whether this connection is emotional, practical, financial, or some combination of all three is something the material leaves somewhat open. But the through line between the boy, family diner, and the man who eventually takes a job at Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rental is unbroken. Michael Afton's adult story is entirely legible as a continuation of the question his childhood raises. What do you do with what you've done when what you've done be undone? There's also the question of what Michael knows, and when he knows it, regarding his father's actual nature. This is one of the more genuinely complicated aspects of interpreting his story. Because the franchise never gives us a clear, timestamp moment where Michael learns the truth about William Afton's crimes. We don't see a scene where Michael discovers his father murdered children at the original pizzeria, or realizes the full extent of what happened to Charlie Emily, or understands that the man who built these machines and ran these restaurants was using them as cover for something the franchise spends considerable runtime establishing as genuinely monstrous. What we can observe is that by the time Michael takes on the job that forms the core of Sister Location, he knows enough to be deliberately searching for his father, which implies he knows enough to understand that his father is someone worth searching for in the specific, troubled sense rather than the ordinary, familial sense. The question of when this knowledge arrives matters, because it affects how we interpret Michael's childhood behavior. If Michael, at the time of the bite of 83, has already witnessed or understood something about his father's relationship with these animatronics, goes beyond simple professional enthusiasm, that changes the texture of his cruelty toward his younger brother somewhat, not excusing it, but potentially complicating the source of it in ways that make the subsequent guilt more layered. And if he discovers his father's true nature only later, as an adult, then his childhood behavior sits in an even more isolated, uncomfortable position. Cruelty that he had no framework to contextualize at the time, that he simply committed because he committed it, and has had to carry alone ever since. The franchise doesn't resolve this cleanly, and the honest approach is to acknowledge both possibilities rather than committing to one. What does seem clear, from everything the material provides, is that by the time Michael is an adult, operating deliberately within this world, he is no longer anyone's bully. He is not the boy who held his brother's head against a mascot suit's open jaws. He is someone who appears to understand, in whatever form that understanding actually took, that something went terribly wrong in his family, and that he bears some portion of the responsibility for it, and who has made the specific choice to walk directly toward the center of that wrongness rather than away from it. Elizabeth Afton's story intersects with Michael's during this same general childhood period, and understanding that intersection matters for grasping the full weight of what he eventually chooses to do as an adult. Elizabeth, as mentioned earlier, develops a specific fascination with Circus Baby, the primary animatronic designed for what will eventually become the Funtime line of technology that her father's company builds. William warns her away from Baby. Whether this warning represents genuine parental protectiveness or something colder, some awareness of what Baby is actually to do that he has no intention of explaining to his daughter, is one of the questions this franchise raises with considerable care and then declines to fully answer. Elizabeth, being a child who loves the things she loves, and who has perhaps inherited something of her father's fundamental inability to be deterred by warnings she doesn't fully understand, eventually gets close enough to Baby for Baby to activate in the way she was designed to, and the outcome for Elizabeth is the same as the outcome for every child who ends up in the wrong proximity to the wrong piece of Afton-designed technology. She dies. Her spirit, in the manner this franchise has established as its operating supernatural rule, becomes bound to the animatronic responsible for her death. Baby doesn't stop being Baby after this. But Baby also, in some meaningful, and eventually very threatening sense, stops being only Baby. Michael presumably knows Elizabeth is gone. He presumably lives through the aftermath of a second sibling's death, a second loss connected to the technology his father builds, a second wound that the household absorbs and continues forward from without any apparent, documented moment of genuine reckoning. 2 of his siblings are dead, one by an accident his own bullying directly caused, one by a machine his father's company manufactured. And William Afton, as far as the material we have access to shows us, keeps working, keeps building, keeps going. What this does to Michael, what it costs him specifically during these years between losing his siblings and making the adult decisions will follow him through in the subsequent chapters of this story, is something the franchise addresses primarily through the consequences of those decisions rather than through direct, emotional depiction. He doesn't get a grief scene. He doesn't get a journal entry or a recorded phone call processing what it means to have outlived both of his younger siblings under these specific circumstances. What he gets, instead, is a mission. He will find his father, he will understand what happened to his family, and he will do whatever is necessary to confront the source of everything that has gone wrong. That mission is still waiting when we pick this story up next, because Michael Afton's adult life is where the full shape of who he is finally comes into focus. The childhood we've just traced is the foundation, the damage that drives everything else, the source of a guilt that transforms itself, over decades, into something that looks almost like heroism. Almost, but not quite. because the franchise is too honest a piece of storytelling to let heroism arrive without cost. And what Michael eventually pays for the choices he makes as an adult is a price so specific, so strange, and so relentlessly appropriate to the world he grew up in that understanding it requires following him all the way through. Everything he does from this point forward, every shift he works and every facility he enters, and every choice he makes when the easier choice was always available, traces back to a birthday party at Fredbear's family diner, a spring lock failure, and a boy who held on too long and never found a way. Fully let go. The guilt a person carries after something like this doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't descend in a single, dramatic moment of clarity the way stories sometimes prefer to depict it. It accumulates. It settles into the ordinary textures of daily life, into the moments between other things, into the specific, unwelcome way a particular smell or sound of afternoon light can suddenly drag you back to a place you've spent considerable effort trying to leave behind. Michael Afton carries the bite of 83 this way, not as a single wound that scars over cleanly, but as something that keeps finding new surfaces to press against as the years pass and the context around it shifts and grows more complicated. What the franchise shows us in the immediate aftermath of that birthday party is almost nothing. And that deliberate withholding tells its own story. We don't see Michael at the hospital. We don't see him in the days immediately following, processing whatever combination of shock and dread and desperate self-justification that a child in his position would almost inevitably reach for first. We don't see him told, in whatever words adults find for these things, that his brother isn't going to recover. We don't see him at any kind of service or memorial, don't see the specific shape of grief in a household that was already, by every indication, not particularly practiced at the kind of emotional that helps people survive loss together. The story cuts away from all of this, and resumes only when it needs Michael to be older. Because what happens during these intervening years is less important to the franchise's purposes than what those years produce in him. But absence of documentation is not absence of experience, and it's worth staying with that gap for a moment before moving past it. Because what fills those undocumented years shapes everything that follows. A child who causes, through his own deliberate actions, the death of a sibling, and who then has to continue living in the same household with the parent whose entire professional world is built around the exact category of machine that delivered that death, is navigating something extraordinarily specific. There, clean way through it. There is no conversation that resolves it, no punishment administered that makes the accounting feel balanced, no ordinary grief process designed to accommodate the particular, complicated position of being simultaneously a bereaved sibling and the person most directly responsible for the bereavement. What seems reasonably clear, piece together everything the franchise eventually shows us about who Michael becomes, is that he does not find a way to simply set this down. Some people in his position might, through some combination of psychological self-protection and the ordinary human capacity for motivated reasoning, gradually revise their own history into something more tolerable. They might tell themselves the spring lock failure was an accident that could have happened to anyone. They might focus on their companions in the act, distributing the responsibility broadly enough that their own portion starts to feel manageable. They might simply refuse to think about it directly, building a life organized around maximum distance from anything that forces the memory back to the surface. Michael does the opposite. Every significant choice we can document him making as an adult represents a deliberate movement toward the center of exactly the thing a person trying to escape this history would instinctively move away from. He doesn't leave Fazbear Entertainment's world behind. He doesn't build a life in some unrelated field in some other city and gradually allow what happened to become something he discusses in past tense with a therapist in a comfortable chair. He stays close. He stays involved. He eventually walks voluntarily into a facility staffed entirely by the same category of machine, killed. And he does it on purpose, with full awareness of what he's walking into, for reasons that have everything to do with the specific kind of guilt that can only be addressed by finishing what you broke rather than walking away from the pieces. This doesn't make him a hero in any uncomplicated sense, and being precise about that matters here, because the temptation when tracing a redemptive arc is to let the redemption retrospectively clean up everything that preceded it. Michael's childhood cruelty toward his brother was real. The bite of 83 was a direct consequence of choices he made. The fact he subsequently spends what appears to be the rest of his life trying to address those consequences in whatever way he can doesn't erase the choices. What it does is give those choices a forward direction, a momentum that carries them out of the category of pure damage and into something considerably more difficult to summarize neatly. While Michael is somewhere in this undocumented period of early life, carrying what he carries, and becoming whoever he's becoming in the absence of any cameras or minigames or official material trained on him, the world he'll eventually have to return to is changing significantly. Fredbear's family diner closes, the weight of the crying child's death and the Springlock failure presumably contributing to whatever combination of practical and reputational damage forces that particular closure, and the partnership between William Afton and Henry Emily doesn't dissolve with it. Instead, it evolves. The diner concept is retired and something considerably more ambitious rises in its place. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, organized around an expanded mascot lineup, a larger physical space, and the kind of public-facing optimism that suggests everyone involved has made a collective decision to treat what happened at the diner as something that can simply be moved past through sufficient forward momentum. The new restaurant features Freddy Fazbear, Bonnie the Rabbit, Chica the Chicken, and Foxy the Pirate Fox. These are the characters most casual fans picture immediately when this franchise comes up in conversation, and they represent a meaningful escalation in both the technical ambition and the public profile of what Afton and Henry are building together. More locations, more foot traffic, more children moving through the space on any given afternoon, more birthday parties and family dinners and ordinary, forgettable evenings that pass without incident and leave no trace in anyone's memory. This is what makes what eventually happens at this restaurant so particularly difficult to absorb when you finally understand it. The ordinary, relentless normalcy of the place, the way it looks from the outside, the way it presumably feels to most of the families who pass through it, provides almost perfect cover for what happens in its less documented hours. Sometime during this period, the years of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza's operation, William Afton commits the crime the franchise calls the missing children incident. 5 children are murdered on the property, their deaths hidden so effectively that the broader public never learns the full truth during the restaurant's operational lifetime. Afton uses a Freddy Fazbear mascot costume as a lure, exploiting exactly the kind of trust that a family entertainment environment naturally generates in children who have no reason to suspect that a beloved mascot figure might be something other than what it appears to be. The murders are revealed to players through hidden mini-games embedded within the original Five Nights at Freddy's, small, 8-bit sequences that appear between survival nights and demand active assembly from the player rather than simply presenting their information directly. These minigames are not optional narrative texture. They are the actual moral center of the first game's storytelling, and what they reveal is that the animatronics roaming the restaurant each night are not malfunctioning machines. They are vessels for the spirits of murdered children, trapped in proximity to their own remains, pursuing an understanding of justice that their deaths have left permanently incomplete. Where is Michael during this period? The honest answer is that we don't know with precision, and the franchise doesn't try to fill that gap with invented specificity. What we do know is that the restaurant is operating, that William Afton has continued working presence within the company, and that whatever relationship Michael has with his father during these years is presumably shaped by everything that's already happened between them and within their family. The deaths of 2 of Michael's siblings, one directly at Michael's own hands and one inside his father's technology, have already occurred by this point. Michael is older now, presumably moving through whatever early adulthood looks like for someone in his position, and whether he knows yet, at any level, what his father is actually doing within the restaurant's back rooms and closed-off spaces is one of the central questions the franchise raises, without resolving. It's tempting to assume Michael must know something. He's the oldest child of the man committing these murders. He presumably has access to parts of his father's life that the general public and even most employees don't. He presumably notices things, if he's paying any attention at all to the world around him, that don't quite add up, that generate questions without comfortable answers, that suggest the person who raised him is something other than the entrepreneurial engineer his professional reputation presents to outside world. But proximity to a secret isn't the same as understanding it, and the franchise has been careful enough about this particular ambiguity that filling it in with confident assertions would represent what the material actually confirms. What is clear is that William Afton's behavior during this period isn't static. He's escalating. The murder of 5 children at a family restaurant isn't a single isolated event, a loss of control in one terrible moment, followed by some kind of return to ordinary functioning. It's a continuation of a pattern that began with Charlie Emily and included the crying child's death, and has apparently survived intact through everything that should, by conventional logic, have introduced some friction into it. The restaurant continues operating. Afton continues working within it, and the 5 children trapped inside its animatronics continue their frustrated, aimless pursuit of something that feels like justice, but expresses itself primarily as the kind of mechanical hostility that eventually drives night security guards out of the premises and eventually into something, worse. The restaurant's end arrives through the accumulating weight of its own problems, through health violations and unresolved disappearance reports, and a smell that reportedly becomes impossible to ignore coming from somewhere within the building's infrastructure. But Afton doesn't go down with it. He remains free, continues his involvement with the company's next ventures, and demonstrates across this entire extended period that he has a capacity for operating completely unsuspected within environments, specifically designed around the well-being of children, that should, when you understand it, clearly be considered one of the more genuinely disturbing aspects of his entire character. There's a second restaurant before the timeline returns its full attention to Michael, and this one complicates the chronology in ways that confused dedicated fans for years before official clarification gradually settled most of the major disputes. The location introduced in Five Nights at Freddy's 2, despite carrying a sequel number in terms of release order, actually takes place chronologically before the original Pizzeria in significant respects, a fact that matters here primarily because it means Afton's documented killing doesn't stop after the original missing children. At this second location, additional murders are committed, including the death of an employee the fandom refers to as Phone Guy, whose recorded messages provide players with most of their directly delivered exposition throughout the early games, and who ends up stuffed into an animatronic suit in a fate that should feel horribly familiar. Afton kills more children here as well, continuing a pattern whose scope only becomes fully apparent once you're assembling the entire timeline, rather than experiencing each game as a standalone entry. The toy animatronics at this location, more advanced than their predecessors and equipped with facial recognition software installed, with considerable irony, as a safety measure, begin exhibiting hostility toward adult men during night hours in ways that suggest the spirits now inhabiting, influencing the building are trying, through the limited channels available to them, to identify the person responsible for what happened to them. They can't act directly. They can't speak plainly. They can only push against the edges of their programming in ways that look like malfunction to anyone who doesn't know what's actually driving the behavior. This detail matters to Michael's story specifically because it illustrates something about the world he's going to have to navigate as an adult. The animatronics that surround him, the ones built by his father's company and populating the various locations this franchise traces, are not neutral objects. They carry specific histories. They respond to specific presences. They are, in the particular supernatural logic this universe operates by, something closer to evidence than to furniture, repositories of exactly the kind of truth that William Afton has spent years successfully suppressing within the ordinary, well-lit, music-playing atmosphere of a family restaurant. Michael is going to have to deal with all of this directly. And the fact that he chooses to rather than choosing to stay far away from it is the central act of his adult character. Following everything that happens across this second location's operational period, Afton faces what should be his final reckoning. The 5 spirits from the original restaurant, still trapped, still aware, still fixated on the person who murdered them, corner Afton within the old building. He panics. He climbs into Spring Bonnie, the same golden rabbit suit from Fredbear's Family Diner, seeking the protection he apparently believes the suit's familiar frame will provide against animatronics who might hesitate to attack something that resembles one of their own. The spring locks fail. The endoskeleton collapses inward. Afton is crushed inside the suit in a manner that should, by any reasonable assessment of human physiology and mechanical force, represent the end of his story. It doesn't, because nothing about William Afton ends when and how it should. He survives, somehow, in a severely diminished state, his body permanently fused with the collapsed machinery, kept alive by mechanisms that the franchise never fully explains, and that seem to operate at the intersection of sheer physical stubbornness and whatever supernatural logic governs a world where murdered children's souls can animate industrial robotics. His ruined body remains within the sealed-off original location, left behind when the building closes for good, and sits there, waiting without actively pursuing anything for years. This is the world Michael Afton is moving through as an adult. His father, the man who built the machines that killed 2 of his siblings, has now apparently met his own end inside one of those same machines, through a justice administered by the spirits of children he murdered rather than by any official consequence or legal accountability. Whether Michael knows this has happened, whether he knows the full sequence of events that led to Springtrap, is another of the questions the franchise leaves genuinely open. But he knows enough. He knows his father has disappeared. He knows the company his father built has a history that the official version of events doesn't fully account for. He knows, in whatever specific and personal way he arrived at this knowledge, that the animatronics his father designed are not simply malfunctioning entertainment equipment, and that the locations his father operated are not simply restaurants that had a run of bad luck. He decides to look for his father directly. The job posting for Circus Babies Entertainment and Rental, a remote underground facility operated by Afton Robotics, arrives at exactly the right moment for Michael's purposes. Or perhaps Michael is looking for it specifically, having followed whatever trail of information and family history he's been quietly assembling for years. The official description of the position is maintenance work, the kind of mundane, technical night shift labor that seems unremarkable on its face, and that would attract no particular attention from anyone monitoring who applies for it and why. The game identifies him only as the technician, a deliberate narrative choice that conceals his identity from players during their first experience of sister location, but that later confirmation from outside the games themselves makes clear this is Michael Afton, using a job application as the opening move in a search he's been working toward for a long time. Understanding what Circus Babies Entertainment actually is, and what it actually contains, requires briefly revisiting Elizabeth Afton's story, because the facility is built directly around her death in a way that is not metaphorical. Circus Baby, the animatronic Elizabeth became obsessed with, and was eventually killed by, is the primary technological centerpiece of the Funtime line that Afton Robotics develops and tests within this underground complex. The facility exists, ostensibly, to manufacture and service these Funtime animatronics for rental purposes, which is a business model unusual enough that it should probably raise questions. But within a company with William Afton's particular history of unusual business decisions presented in the language of ordinary entertainment industry operations, it apparently doesn't raise sufficient questions to prevent it from functioning. The funtime animatronics populating this facility are more sophisticated than anything previously built under the Fazbear Entertainment umbrella. Funtime Freddy with his puppet companion Bun Bun. Funtime Foxy, confirmed through later supplementary material to be a repurposed version of the Mangle animatronic from the second restaurant. And Circus Baby herself, the machine that killed Elizabeth Afton, and that now contains, in whatever complicated sense this franchise uses the word contains, the spirit that was Elizabeth Afton, existing in some uneasy, imprecise fusion with the animatronic's own underlying systems in a way that makes it genuinely difficult to identify where the machine ends and the trapped consciousness begins. Michael descends into this facility and begins his first night's work, guided by an artificial intelligence voice that provides him with instructions and context in the measured, professional tone of something designed specifically to sound helpful and unthreatening. The instructions describe routine maintenance tasks. The tone implies an ordinary workplace. Everything about the facility's official presentation is calibrated toward keeping the person inside it oriented toward mundane professional expectations rather than toward the obvious and significant wrongness that begins making itself felt almost immediately. Circus Baby speaks to him directly, not in the mode of a pre-programmed performance routine, but in something considerably more deliberate, more aware, more clearly connected to a consciousness that has been waiting inside this facility for a long time, and that recognizes in Michael's presence either the son of its creator or simply an opportunity, or possibly both, simultaneously. She offers him guidance. She warns him about specific dangers within specific sections of the facility. She provides information that frequently conflicts with what the facility's primary controlling system is telling him. And she does this in a way that is calculated to build trust, to position herself as the ally he should be listening to, and to gradually orient him toward whatever outcome she's been working long before he arrived. This is one of the more genuinely unsettling dynamics Sister Location establishes, because it asks you to sit with the possibility that Baby's apparent helpfulness toward Michael is completely sincere and simultaneously completely self-serving. She may actually, in whatever sense applies to a consciousness that is both a murdered child's spirit and a sophisticated artificial intelligence, care about Michael. She may genuinely want to help him. She may also be helping him specifically because doing so advances her own agenda in ways that will eventually cost him considerably more than the maintenance position he signed up for. These two possibilities are not mutually exclusive, and the franchise is careful not to force a choice between them. What Michael encounters over his first several nights working within this facility builds a picture that is simultaneously exactly what he expected to find. Evidence of his father's technology, his father's methods, the specific shape of what William Afton considers an acceptable professional operation, and something considerably more personal and disturbing than a simple confirmation of what he already suspected. Elizabeth is here. Not in any form that permits reunion, not in any way that resembles the sister he grew up alongside in anything more than the most indirect sense, but here in the specific way the franchise uses presence to mean something more than physical location. The consciousness that was Elizabeth Afton is inside Circus Baby, inside this facility his father built, inside a machine his father designed, do exactly what it eventually did to her, and whatever that consciousness has become in the years since her death, it is not passive, it is not at rest, and it has its own plans for what happens next. The nights inside Circus Baby's entertainment and rental escalate in the manner that anyone who has spent time with this franchise expects them to escalate, which is to say, the ordinary professional expectations break down progressively and are replaced by something that operates on a different, more threatening logic entirely. The facility is not simply a manufacturing and service operation. The animatronics within it are not simply machines requiring routine maintenance. The controlling intelligence managing the facility is not simply an administrative system designed for operational efficiency. Everything Michael encounters over these nights is part of a structure whose actual purpose has nothing to do any of its official stated functions. A fire breaks out in the facility's primary auditorium. This is not incidental. Within the larger sequence of events that Sister Location is building toward, the fire functions as both a catalyst and a cover, clearing certain obstacles and creating the conditions under which the facility's animatronics can execute a plan they've apparently been working toward for considerably longer than Michael has been present. The Funtime animatronics shed their external shells, their endoskeletons stripped of the surface material that made them recognizable as individual performers with individual names and individual performance routines, come together into a single combined form that the fandom has named Enard, tangled, grotesque amalgamation of wires and mechanical components and synthetic material, composite entity that represents the combined will of everything this facility contains, including baby, including whatever remains of Elizabeth within her. And this composite entity, assembled from the wreckage of everything Afton Robotics ever built in this underground space, needs a way out. It needs something that can pass through the surface world without immediately communicating that it is what it is. It needs a body. Michael is standing in the facility when he realizes, if he realizes it at all before it happens, what Enard intends to use him for. The scooper is a mechanism built into the facility's infrastructure that is described in terms clinical enough to communicate its function without lingering on it in any way that would serve anything except horror for its own sake. It removes the biological interior of a human body, the specific contents that make a living person something other than a mobile surface, and leaves behind a shell sufficiently intact to serve as a disguise. Michael encounters this mechanism in the way the facility has been maneuvering him toward encountering it since his first night on the job, and what happens to him inside is one of the stranger, more genuinely unique things that happens to any character across this franchise's entire accumulated. He survives. Not in any ordinary sense of the word, not in any sense that a conversation with a medical professional would recognize as technically accurate given the mechanism's described function, but he survives in the specific, stubborn, franchise logic sense that means his consciousness persists within a physical form that should not, by conventional assessment, be capable of sustaining it anymore. Enard uses that form as its exit from the facility, piloting Michael's body through whatever surface world exists above this underground complex. Using him as the camouflage, it needs to move through spaces where an obvious amalgamation of mechanical parts would attract exactly the kind of attention it needs to avoid. For a period of time that the franchise deliberately leaves vague rather than pinning to a specific duration, Michael exists in this state, alive in some technically qualified sense, occupied by something that is not him, his body deteriorating from the inside in the manner you would expect a body to deteriorate when its ordinary biological interior has been replaced by the specific contents now inhabiting it. Enard eventually makes the pragmatic decision that Michael's body has degraded past the point of usefulness as a disguise, and departs, leaving behind whatever is left of the physical form that was once Michael Afton. What's left is still Michael. This is the detail that matters most for everything that follows, and it's a detail the franchise handles with a particular, quiet restraint that makes it land harder than any dramatic depiction might have. He doesn't die when Enard leaves. He shouldn't survive by any reasonable standard, but he does, in the same fundamental way he's been surviving things that should reasonably have ended him since the birthday party at Fredbear's family diner that he can never fully leave behind. He is changed. He is visibly, permanently altered in ways the game communicates through the specific color his skin takes on in the cutscene, depicting this aftermath. But serves as the franchise's shorthand for something that is technically alive, while being deeply and irreversibly not quite right. In any way you could easily specify. He drags himself through whatever follows, and he keeps going. He keeps looking. He hasn't found his father yet, hasn't completed what he came here to do, hasn't in any sense that would satisfy the particular, specific kind of guilt he's been carrying since before he was old enough to understand fully what guilt meant. And Nard is somewhere in the world above the facility, assembled from the machine his sister died inside, alongside the other machines his father built. And his father is somewhere in the world beyond that, trapped in a ruined Spring Bonnie suit inside a sealed building that a new group of people are in the process of turning into a horror attraction, because they think the horror it contains is fictional. Michael knows none of this yet, or perhaps he knows some of it, pieces assembled from whatever information he arrived here with and whatever he understood about the facility before it did what it did to him. What he knows for certain is that he came here looking for something and did not find it, that the search is not over, and that whatever condition his body is now in, whatever the specific logistics of continuing to exist in this altered state actually involve on a dated level, he has not run out of reasons to keep moving forward. That forward motion, toward his father, toward whatever answer the end of this story might provide. What makes Michael Afton worth following through everything that still remains ahead of him? He has been, since the beginning, a person shaped by damage he caused and damage he received in roughly equal measure, and he has responded to that damage not by escaping it, but by walking directly into its source. Whatever comes next in his story, whatever the next facility and the next encounter, and the next version of what he has to face actually look like, they will be met by someone who has already lost more than most characters in fiction are asked to surrender, and who has not, despite any of it, stopped. The thing about surviving something that should kill you is that survival itself becomes a kind of question. Not a triumphant one, not the kind of survival that arrives with clarity about what comes next and why it matters that you're still here, but the quieter, more disorienting kind, where the simple fact of continued existence demands an explanation you don't yet have and aren't sure you're equipped to find. Michael Afton survives what happens to him inside Circus Baby's entertainment and rental in exactly this way. Not cleanly. Not any Cineverse has decided he deserves more time for reasons it's prepared to articulate. He survives the way something survives when it simply refuses, against all reasonable mechanical expectation, to stop. The cutscene that depicts his condition in the aftermath of the scooping is one of the stranger, more quietly disturbing pieces of visual storytelling this franchise has produced, precisely because of how little it dramatizes. There's no extended sequence of agony, no theatrical confrontation with what he's become, no moment where Michael stands in front of a reflective surface and processes his altered appearance with the kind of expressive anguish that a different kind of story might reach for automatically. Instead, there's simply Michael, visibly wrong in a way the game communicates through the specific coloration of his skin, a gray-purple tone the franchise has trained its audience to associate with something biological that is no longer functioning the way biology is supposed to function, moving through the world above the facility that recently finished doing to him what it did. He records something in the manner of his father's various employees who have left recorded messages scattered across this franchise's accumulated history, and what he says in that recording is worth examining closely because it tells you more about who Michael Afton actually is at this specific moment in his story than almost anything else the material provides. He doesn't express horror at his condition. He doesn't dwell on what was taken from him or what he's been left with in its place. He expresses frustration, a specific, focused frustration aimed not inward at himself, but outward at the situation. The fact that he came here with a purpose and the purpose remains unfinished, despite everything the facility put him through to prevent him from completing it. He tells whatever absent audience he's addressing that he's going to find his father, that he's going to put right what has gone wrong, using phrasing that echoes the specific language of obligation and inherited responsibility rather than anything that sounds like personal ambition or revenge. This matters because it would be very easy, at this point in Michael's story, to read what he's doing as revenge. His father built the technology that killed his brother. His father built the technology that killed his sister. His father's company built the facility that did what it did to Michael's own body. The case for reading his continued pursuit of William Afton as vengeance rather than redemption is not without supporting evidence. But the language he uses in this recording, and the specific framing of his stated goal, repair rather than punishment, setting things right rather than making someone pay, suggests something considerably more complicated than a son hunting his father to make him account for accumulated damage, in the most direct possible. What Michael is after is harder to name than revenge, because it doesn't reduce to a single clear outcome. He wants to find his father because his father is the point of origin for everything that has gone wrong across this entire family's history. And because finding him, understanding him, confronting whatever he actually is and whatever he has actually done, is the only remaining move available to someone who has already tried everything else. He tried, through years of undocumented adult life, to live alongside the knowledge of what his bullying produced. He tried, by walking into Circus Baby's entertainment and rental, to address the damage his father caused directly, to reach into the machinery his father built and retrieve whatever truth was buried inside it. That attempt cost him his body's ordinary functioning and produced Enard somewhere in the world above. An outcome that solves nothing and actually makes the broader situation considerably worse in certain respects. So he keeps going. In whatever state he's in, through whatever combination of stubbornness and guilt-driven obligation and the franchise's particular supernatural logic about what's possible for someone who has passed through what he's passed through, Michael Afton keeps moving in the direction of his father, and the next location that direction eventually leads him toward is one he didn't build and didn't choose, and that exists specifically because other people with no meaningful understanding of the actual history involved, decided that the legend of the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza was worth monetizing. Fazbear's Fright. The horror attraction opens with exactly the kind of blissfully ignorant commercial energy that characterizes every new Fazbear entertainment venture built on top of something it doesn't actually understand. The people behind it see an urban legend. They see a decommissioned restaurant with an unresolved reputation for mysterious disappearances, the kind of true crime adjacent notoriety that a certain kind of entertainment entrepreneur looks at and sees potential rather than warning. They begin salvaging what they can from the original location, incorporating authentic pieces of the building's history into their attraction's design, because authenticity in the horror attraction business is understood to mean that customers will pay more for genuine props than for convincing replicas. Among the salvage is a damaged golden rabbit suit, found collapsed in on itself within the original building's sealed interior, looking like something that has experienced a level of physical trauma considerably beyond what any mascot costume should reasonably be subjected to over the course of an ordinary commercial lifespan. To the people pulling it from the wreckage, this is simply an unusually creepy, unusually well-preserved prop, exactly the kind of centerpiece their attraction needs. They have no framework for understanding what they're actually looking at, because the framework required to understand it accurately involves information they don't have access to, and wouldn't believe if someone attempted to provide it. They bring the suit into the attraction and position within the display, and Fazbear's Fright opens to paying customers who walk through the space specifically hoping to be frightened in the safe, contained way that a purpose-built haunted attraction is designed to provide. The horror is supposed to be theatrical. It's supposed to be bounded, scheduled, and available for exit through clearly marked doors. What these customers are actually walking past, what they're paying for proximity to, and then returning home from, is William Afton's ruined body, still technically alive inside the collapsed machinery, kept going by mechanisms that the franchise declines to fully explain and that seem to operate somewhere in the territory between sheer physical obstinacy and the specific supernatural logic of a universe where murdered children's souls can inhabit industrial entertainment equipment. He begins moving. This is the development that eventually necessitates a night security guard at the attraction, which is where players enter the experience that constitutes Five Nights at Freddy's 3. The guard's job exists because the attraction keeps experiencing equipment malfunctions and unexplained technical problems during overnight hours, which is the institutional language available to describe what is actually happening, which is that the thing inside the golden rabbit suit has retained enough awareness and physical capability to navigate the space after dark in a way that triggers the facility's various electronic systems as it passes through them. The malfunctions aren't malfunctions, they're evidence. Springtrap is the name the fandom assigns to this version of Afton, a name that didn't originate within the franchise's official material, but that has become so thoroughly integrated in how this community discusses this character that the franchise itself eventually adopted it in various contexts. The name earns itself immediately and completely because it describes exactly what's happened to the man wearing it. He is trapped. Not in the metaphorical sense that a person might be said to be trapped by their circumstances or their history or the consequences of choices they can no longer unmake, but in a literal, physical, mechanical sense. His body and the suit's collapsed endoskeleton have been fused by the spring lock, failure into a configuration that cannot simply be removed or separated through ordinary means. He wears the suit because the suit has become part of him in the specific, terrible way that machinery becomes part of a person when it fails inward rather than outward. The franchise's depiction of Springtrap moving Fazbear's Fright during the overnight hours is one of the more genuinely unsettling things this series has produced, partly because of what it communicates about William Afton's persistence, and partly because of what it communicates about his current state. He's not the purposeful, organized figure who moved through the original restaurant using a mascot costume, deliberate camouflage. He's not the calculated presence who built Circus Baby's entertainment and rental to serve specific, if concealed, objectives. He's something more diminished than either of those versions, operating in the limited way that something operates when most of its ordinary resources have been stripped away and only whatever is most essential to it remains. In Afton's case, what remains appears to be the drive to continue existing, which has always seemed to outpace every other consideration in his life. But Afton isn't the only presence active within Fazbear's Fright. And this is where the chapter of Michael's story that runs alongside these events starts to connect what's happening in the attraction itself, in ways that become important for understanding where both stories are heading. The 5 children whose spirits were trapped in the original animatronics, the same souls who chased Afton into the Spring Bonnie suit in the first place, haven't simply to be a factor, because their original vessels were eventually decommissioned, and the restaurant that housed them was closed. They persist, in a weakened and less physically anchored form, connected to the building's atmosphere, rather than to any specific functioning machine. The security guard at Fazbear's Fright experienced what the game frames as hallucinations, fragmented visual intrusions of old animatronic designs, distorted sounds, corrupted images that push into the edges of an otherwise ordinary night shift. These aren't malfunctions either. They're communication from presences that have been waiting a long time for an opportunity to finish what they started. The franchise introduces here a mechanic that becomes one of its most structurally significant storytelling devices, one that will recur across later entries in forms both similar and considerably evolved from this original version. Hidden within the nights at Fazbear's Fright are minigame sequences that players can locate and complete, each one tied to a specific child and a specific object connected to that child's death. Completing these sequences in their proper order, finding all of them, and seeing each one through, produces the game's true ending, a quiet sequence depicting the 5 children finally achieving something the franchise frames as rest, their unresolved business addressed sufficiently to allow them to move on from the physical world they've been anchored to since their deaths at Afton's years earlier. This mechanic matters to Michael's story in a way that goes beyond its in-game function, because it establishes something about how this universe operates that will govern everything subsequently attempts to do with what remains of his own life. The souls trapped in these machines don't need a trial. They don't need official acknowledgement from any institution. They need the specific, individual recognition of what happened to each of them, the acknowledgement of their particular deaths as specific events with specific victims rather than as a generalized tragedy, and they need that acknowledgement delivered through deliberate action of someone willing to seek it out rather than waiting for it to be handed over. The game is asking players to do something the world within the fiction has consistently failed to do. See these children as individuals and act accordingly. The fire that eventually destroys Fazbear's Fright arrives in a manner the game leaves genuinely open to interpretation in terms of precise causation. Some readings connect it directly to Springtrap's increasingly erratic movement through the facility during overnight hours. Others treat it as an accident arising from the general instability of a hastily constructed attraction housed in a condemned space and operated by people with insufficient understanding of what they were actually managing. What the franchise does commit to clearly is the outcome. The building burns, and within that fire, the 5 trapped children receive the confrontation with Afton they've been building toward since the moment he sealed himself inside the Spring Bonnie suit. The true ending sequence depicts them finally, quietly leaving. Whatever held them to this world, whatever unfinished quality their deaths retained that kept them from passing to whatever comes next within this universe's metaphysics, resolves in the context of this particular fire in this particular building. They get not justice in any legal or narrative sense, but something the franchise treats as its functional equivalent: rest. Afton does not get rest. The fire doesn't produce a clean, unambiguous death for Springtrap in the way that conventional narrative logic might suggest it should. And this is both consistent with everything the franchise has established about William Afton's relationship with conventional endings and genuinely frustrating to anyone hoping for a clear, documented conclusion to his story at this particular point. The game refuses to confirm his death outright. What it shows is a building on fire and the implication that Springtrap is somewhere within it, and then it shows nothing further at this specific moment, leaving the question of what happens to him in this fire deliberately, characteristically open. Michael presumably knows that Fazbear's Fright exists, and presumably understands, given everything he knows about his father and about the original restaurant and about the springlock suits that connect those 2 locations in the specific, terrible way they're connected, what the golden rabbit prop that the attraction is built around actually represents. Whether he has direct contact with events at Fazbear's Fright, whether he's physically present in the area during the period of its operation, whether he knows about the fire before it happens or about it afterward through whatever channels information about things like this travels through, the franchise doesn't document with any specificity. What it does document is where Michael eventually ends up, which is somewhere considerably further along in his search than the underground facility that nearly ended his story entirely. The gap between Fazbear's Fright's fire and the next documented appearance of Michael Afton in this timeline is one of those silences the franchise uses deliberately, the kind that asks you to imagine what a person does with themselves during the period between one significant event and the next, rather directly. Michael is alive, in his particular altered sense of the word, and he's been through Circus Baby's entertainment and rental and whatever aftermath followed it, and he knows his father has been inside the Spring Bonnie suit in a sealed building, and he knows that building has recently burned, and he needs to determine what, if anything, is left to pursue. The answer turns out to be more than you'd expect. What comes into focus gradually, as Michael pieces together whatever information him, through whatever combination of personal knowledge and research, and the specific insight available to someone who grew up in William Afton's household, is that his father is not definitively gone. The fire at Fazbear's Fright produces ambiguity rather than confirmation, and ambiguity where William Afton is concerned has, across this entire timeline, consistently resolved in the direction of Afton still being present in some form rather than having actually concluded. Michael understands this, or comes to understand it, in the way that a person who has been paying close attention to a pattern enough eventually recognizes when that pattern is continuing rather than concluding. There's also the question of what the fire produces beyond Afton's uncertain fate. The 5 children from the original restaurant are, according to the game's true ending, finally at rest, which represents a genuine change in the landscape of what remains unfinished. Their presence, their specific, individual need for something the world consistently failed to provide them, was a significant part of what held certain things in place across this timeline. With them gone, the specific configuration of the haunting that has defined Pizzeria Entertainment's various locations for years is altered in ways that create new possibilities and new absence simultaneously. Michael knows some of this. He knows things about the souls trapped in his father's machines that most people who've encountered this franchise's various disasters don't know, because he grew up within proximity to the source of those machines and has spent his adult life moving deliberately through spaces where their presence is most concentrated and most active. He has, through the specific, costly education provided by everything he's been through since taking the job at Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rental, a more complete understanding of what his father built, what it costs, and what addressing it actually requires than almost anyone else alive in this universe at this particular point in its history. And person knows. Henry Emily has been watching this entire situation develop across decades, from the position of a man who believed for a long time that his daughter's death was an accident, and who eventually, at some undocumented point that the franchise doesn't pin to a specific moment, learned the truth about what his business partner actually was and what his business partner actually did. Henry's knowledge of the full scope of William Afton's crimes, including Charlie's death, which was personal to him in a way that nothing else in this franchise's accumulated tragedy quite matches, been quietly shaping his actions and his planning for longer than most of the stories documented. Timeline makes immediately apparent. The collaboration between Michael and Henry, or at minimum the parallel convergence of their independent efforts toward the same outcome, becomes the organizing principle of what happens next. They don't arrive at the endgame separately, with Henry on one track and Michael on another. What eventually comes together at the final location in this sequence represents the combined intelligence of 2 people who have spent years, from different positions, with different specific knowledge, working out what would actually be required to end this properly rather than simply containing it long enough for it to escape again in some new form. Michael's specific contribution to this is the bait, the inheritance that comes to him through the collapsed remains of Pizzeria Entertainment's business holdings provides the means, and his own particular understanding of his father's behavior provides the logic. William Afton returns to wherever the animatronics end up. He has demonstrated this pattern with the original restaurant's closure, with Fazbear's fright, across every iteration of his connection to these machines. He will return again, if the conditions are right, if the animatronics are present, if the location provides the kind of access his damaged physical form requires to make reappearance possible. Michael builds a pizzeria. On paper, it's a restaurant, a new Fazbear Entertainment venture, plausible enough in its surface presentation to attract the salvage it needs to attract, and unremarkable enough in its official description to avoid drawing the kind of attention that would interfere with its actual purpose. He populates it with what the franchise calls salvage, animatronics purchased cheaply from across Fazbear Entertainment's various collapsed ventures. Exactly the kind of decommissioned, damaged machinery that a legitimate new location would acquire, because it's available and inexpensive, and nobody wants it. But Michael knows what he's collecting. Scrap Baby, the damaged remnant of Circus Baby, containing the spirit of his sister Elizabeth in whatever complicated, fused form that spirit now exists. Molten Freddy, the tangled remains of Enard, the entity assembled from the Funtime animatronics and sent out into the world through Michael's own body, now broken down further into something considerably less coherent but no less present. Lefty, an animatronic whose outward appearance suggests nothing in particular, and whose actual contents represent Henry's contribution to this operation. Something will arrive at fully in the next chapter of this story. Michael works the night shift at his own pizzeria, unnamed on screen, again operating under cover rather than as himself, for reasons that range from the practical to the deeply personal. He is, at this point, visibly and significantly altered from whatever he looked like before Circus Baby's entertainment and rental finished with him. The purple-gray discoloration that marks him as someone who has passed through something his body was never designed to accommodate is not the kind of appearance that invites ordinary, professional interaction, without question. He operates in the way he's learned to operate across years of doing exactly this. At night, with sufficient distance between himself and the people who might ask questions he can't answer in terms they'd accept, moving toward the thing he needs to do rather than away from it. His father finds him, which is also to say Michael finds his father, because this is what the trap was designed to produce. William Afton, drawn toward the collection of animatronics and the location housing them by whatever combination of instinct and supernatural compulsion has governed his movements across this entire timeline, arrives. What arrives is Scraptrap, a further deteriorated version of the damaged form that Fazbear's Fright housed, reduced by the intervening fire and time to something that is even easily recognizable as the man who once stood at a workshop bench with Henry Emily building the first prototypes, a technology that would go on to define this franchise's entire catalog of horrors. He is damaged almost past the point of coherence. He is also somehow still here, still moving, still oriented toward whatever the fundamental drive that has sustained him across Springlock failure and fire and decades of deterioration actually is. The game's final night arrives. Henry reveals himself through communications that have been reaching Michael across the nights, patient and precise in the manner of someone who has spent a long time preparing a specific thing and is now watching it proceed according to the plan he built for it. Henry, his daughter's spirit here. Charlie, killed by Afton at Afton Family diner at the very beginning of this entire timeline, contained within Lefty in a manner that represents Henry's own contribution to the salvage Michael assembled, is present for the conclusion that Henry has been working toward in whatever form his planning and preparation over the years has actually taken. Henry locks the building. The conclusion he has designed for this situation involves fire, the same element that has appeared at the significant closing moments across this franchise's timeline, and Henry's use of it here is deliberate where its earlier appearances were ambiguous. He has determined, through whatever years of thought and grief and methodical preparation he's applied to this problem, that the only intervention capable of actually ending what his business partnered is complete destruction rather than containment. And he makes the decision to be present for that destruction himself rather than administering it from a safe distance. For Michael, the pizzeria fire represents the conclusion of the search he began, in some meaningful sense, at the birthday party that ended his brother's life. He came into this situation looking for his father, looking for whatever understanding or confrontation or final reckoning might exist at the end of the trail his father's particular history creates. He found him, eventually, in a form so deteriorated and so far from anything recognizably human that the confrontation available to him is considerably different from whatever version of it he might have imagined when he started looking. There's no conversation, no exchange that satisfies the questions Michael has presumably been carrying since childhood. No moment where William Afton looks at his surviving son and says anything that resembles the kind of acknowledgement a person in Michael's position might have spent years hoping for. What there is instead is the fire, and the specific, strange piece available in a situation where what you've been trying is finally, actually finishing, even if the finish looks nothing like what you might have chosen if the choice had been entirely yours. Michael survives the fire in the specific, uncertain sense that the franchise extends to his survival throughout this story. The game doesn't document his death within the building. It also doesn't produce a clean image of him walking away from it with any particular sense of resolution or closure, because this franchise has never been particularly interested in providing the kind of tidy emotional punctuation that conventional narratives typically place at the end of a redemptive arc. What it provides instead is the quiet confirmation that the primary mission is complete. His father's story, as a physical presence capable of acting on whatever drives him, has concluded within that building. The spirits gathered there, including his sister and the original victims, and whatever remains of the various presences that have been circulating through Fazbear Entertainment's technology, since before Michael was old enough to understand what animatronics actually were, have been released in the manner Henry designed. The cycle his father initiated, through years of violence and concealment, and the exploitation of exactly the kind of ordinary trust that a family entertainment environment generates, has been broken. Michael Afton's story, the part of it that involves active searching and deliberate movement toward an objective he set himself years before he fully understood its cost, ends here in the most literal documented sense the franchise provides. What remains of him afterward, and whether there is an afterward in any meaningful sense, given everything his body has been through by this point in the timeline, is not something the games address with any directness or specificity. He simply doesn't appear again, in any form the material makes clear is Michael, after the fire that closes this chapter of the franchise's larger story. But his absence from the subsequent material doesn't mean his story has no further reach. Because what Michael Afton did across the span of his adult life didn't happen in a sealed chamber with no lasting effects on anything outside it. The trail he followed, the understanding he accumulated, the decisions he made about what was worth sacrificing and something he believed genuinely needed doing. These things don't disappear when he stops being documentable within the timeline. They become part of the structure that makes everything that follows possible, the foundation underneath the next generation of this story, even though Michael himself is nowhere visible within it. That next generation is already developing, somewhere above the fire's ash, in digital spaces and corporate structures, and the mind of at least one person who has no idea yet how thoroughly the history she's about to inherit will reshape everything she understands about the company whose employment she's accepted, the technology she's been asked to work with, and the specific, stubborn, refused-to-conclude nature of whatever remains of the consciousness at the center of this entire story. The fire, William Afton's physical story, does not announce itself as a conclusion. It doesn't arrive with the kind of ceremonial weight that finales in conventional storytelling tend to carry, where the music swells and the camera holds and the audience is given sufficient time to recognize that what they're witnessing represents the closing of something significant. It arrives the way most of the genuinely important moments across this franchise's history arrive, quietly, with considerable ambiguity about exactly what it means and for whom, and with enough loose threads trailing behind it that the people closest to the events can't be entirely certain even, standing in the aftermath, that what just happened is actually finished. Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator is the game that houses this conclusion, and it's worth spending a moment on the specific manner in which it presents itself before moving into what it actually contains, because the presentation is itself part of the storytelling. It opens with the appearance of a simple, cheerful management simulation, the kind of lightweight game that exists in a completely different category from the survival horror the franchise built its reputation on. You click buttons. You manage a restaurant. You buy equipment and navigate business decisions in a register that seems almost playful, deliberately incongruous with everything else associated with this franchise. Players arriving after the previous entries experience a brief, genuine disorientation, a sense that perhaps they've loaded the wrong game, or that this represents some kind of tonal experiment that will eventually reveal its actual nature. It reveals its actual nature. And when it does, what's underneath the cheerful management surface is the most emotionally complete piece of storytelling this franchise had produced up to that point. Because Pizzeria Simulator isn't simply another survival chapter in an ongoing series. It's the chapter where the people who have been quietly working towards something specific across the entire span of this franchise's history finally get to finish what they started, at a cost that the game is honest enough not to minimize or dress up in more comfortable language than the situation actually warrants. Michael is working the night shift. He's always working the night shift, across every documented chapter of his adult life, which is both a practical reality of his altered condition and a detail the franchise seems aware carries its own quiet symbolic weight. A person who can't operate easily in ordinary daylight, who has passed through something that makes conventional public interaction complicated, who has spent years moving toward objectives that require patience rather than visibility, naturally ends up in the overnight hours. Michael's story has always been a night shift story, and Pizzeria Simulator represents his last one. The salvage mechanic that structure certain portions of the game deserves attention here, because it's doing more than providing a gameplay function. Each animatronic that Michael assesses and potentially brings into the building represents a decision, a deliberate choice, introduce a specific presence into the space he's prepared. Scrap Baby arrives, damaged and reduced from the circus baby, who killed Elizabeth Afton in the facility of an earlier chapter, but containing in whatever compressed, complicated form whatever remains of Elizabeth herself. Molten Freddy, the tangled remnant of Enard, the entity assembled from the Funtime line and sent out into the world through Michael's body, arrives in a state of significant deterioration, but still present in the fundamental sense this franchise reserves for things that refuse to conclude. Naturally, and Scraptrap himself arrives at some point, the further diminished form of the ruined Spring Bonnie suit that housed William Afton across Fazbear's Fright, and the fire that followed it, moving and aware in the specific, stubborn manner of something that has survived multiple events that should have ended it conclusively. The fourth salvage, Lefty, is the one that carries Henry's contribution to this operation. What's inside Lefty is the piece of this plan that makes it something other than simply a trap for William Afton. Something other than a son luring his father back into proximity in order to arrange whatever confrontation is available to them after everything they've each become across this timeline. Henry, Charlie here. Charlotte Emily, killed by William Afton at Fredbear's family diner at the very beginning of this entire story. The first child whose death initiated the pattern that eventually consumed 2 full generations of connected to Fazbear entertainment, is present within this building in the form her spirit has occupied since Henry arranged it, contained within Lefty, waiting for the conclusion her father has been building toward since he finally understood the truth about how she actually died. Henry's recorded messages to Michael across the nights of this game are one of the more quietly devastating pieces of writing in this franchise's entire accumulated output, specifically because of how completely they reveal the interior landscape of a man who has spent decades carrying something the narrative has previously shown us only from the outside. He addresses Michael directly, which itself communicates something important about the nature of their connection and the extent to which this operation represents genuine collaboration rather than parallel independent efforts that happened to converge at the same location. He has known what he was building toward. He has known for long enough that the plan has been refined past the point of raw grief into something considerably more precise and considerably more costly. The plan requires Henry to be inside the building when it burns. This is the specific detail that separates what Henry chooses to do here from every other fire that has appeared across this franchise's timeline. The fire at Fazbear's Fright was ambiguous in its causation and uncontrolled in its execution. The fire at Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator is deliberate, precisely administered, and personally occupied. Henry has decided, through whatever years of thought and loss and methodical preparation he's applied to this problem, that the only way to genuinely end what his business partner started is to be willing to end alongside it, rather than standing outside it and watching it conclude from a position of relative safety. Why? The franchise doesn't state it as explicitly as a more conventional story might. But the answer that emerges from everything Henry has been shown to be across the narrative is reasonably clear. He carries guilt that mirrors Michael's in certain ways while being entirely distinct in its specific character. Michael is guilty of the active cruelty that led to his brother's death, a guilt rooted in deliberate choice, even if the specific catastrophic outcome wasn't intended. Henry is guilty of the sustained, extended trust that allowed William Afton to operate within reach of children for far longer than he should have, a guilt rooted not in action, but in the failure to see something, in retrospect, carried warnings he should have recognized sooner. Being present for the conclusion isn't punishment in any simple sense. It's Henry's way of ensuring that this particular ending is the kind that actually holds, administered by someone, sufficient investment in its to see it through rather than delegating it to circumstances and hoping for the best. His farewell addresses the various presences gathered in the building, and the franchise grants each of them a specific acknowledgement that the broader world they died within consistently failed to provide them. He speaks to the children who died at the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, children the official record never fully accounted for, and whose families presumably never received complete answers about what happened to them. He speaks to Charlie, his daughter, directly, in the language of a father who has spent years trying to find the right words for something that doesn't have right words, and who has finally decided that the words matter less than the act that accompanies them. And he speaks to William Afton, not with the elaborate condemnation that the accumulated evidence of Afton's crimes might seem to demand, but with something considerably quieter and in its own way more devastating. A simple, final acknowledgement that this is over now, that the thing Afton started has reached the point where it concludes, and that Henry is going to be present to make certain that's actually what happens. The fire takes the building. What happens to William Afton inside it is, for the first time across this franchise's entire treatment of his various apparent deaths, presented with something closer to genuine finality than any of his previous endings managed to achieve. The spirits gathered within the building, including Charlie and the other presences Henry has brought together here, are released in the manner his plan was designed. The cycle concludes. The chapter that began at Fredbear's family diner, with a friendship and a workshop and two men building machines they believed would bring children joy, closes in a burning pizzeria with two people who loved those children enough to sacrifice themselves to make certain nothing like this continues. And Michael, surviving the fire in the specific, uncertain sense the franchise has extended to his survival across this entire story, carries the outcome forward into the silence that follows. What follows is one of the stranger narrative spaces this franchise occupies, the gap between Pizzeria Simulator's conclusion and the next documented events in the timeline, a gap the franchise fills partially with a game that doesn't function quite like anything else in the series. Ultimate Custom Night exists at the intersection of fan service and metaphysical implication, presenting every significant antagonist from this franchise's accumulated history together in a single endlessly replayable night, and framing the entire experience through a perspective that the game's own internal logic strongly suggests belongs to William Afton's consciousness rather than to any new player character. The implications of this framing for Michael's story are indirect, but worth engaging with seriously. If Ultimate Custom Night represents some form of afterlife experience belonging to William Afton, a psychological purgatory constructed from the specific texture of everything he spent his life doing, then the fire at Pizzeria Simulator didn't end Afton in the complete, definitive sense that Henry's plan was designed to achieve. His physical form is gone. His ability to act directly on the world through the damaged machinery he's been inhabiting across multiple games is gone. But something persists, in some space that operates between the physical and whatever comes after it in this franchise's particular cosmology, that is still recognizably Afton in some functional sense. This creates a specific problem for Michael's legacy within the timeline, because if the fire didn't fully end his father, then what Michael helped build and what he helped Henry execute, at what a cost to himself, achieved less than they intended, not nothing. The physical threat is resolved. The children are released. The specific configuration of haunting that has defined Fazbear Entertainment's various locations across decades is dismantled. But the consciousness at the center of it, the thing that was William Afton before spring locks and fire and decades of deterioration, reduced him to a series of progressively more damaged physical forms, hasn't concluded in the way that Henry's plan assumed conclusion was possible. What this means in practical terms becomes considerably clearer once the timeline advances into the events of Five Nights at Freddy's. Help Wanted were a virtual reality project developed under the Fazbear Entertainment brand, something into its code that shouldn't be there. Glitchtrap is the name given to the corrupted presence discovered within the VR experience, a digital entity that presents itself form of a golden rabbit, which is either an obvious visual reference to Spring Bonnie and Springtrap, or a genuine remnant of William Afton's consciousness that has found a new medium of persistence after the physical options were exhausted. The distinction between these two possibilities, whether Glitchtrap is a literal continuation of Afton or a new entity that formed in the shape his history left behind, is one the franchise has not resolved with the kind of specificity that permits a single definitive answer. Michael doesn't appear in Help Wanted. His documented presence in this franchise effectively concludes with the Pizzeria Simulator fire and the subsequent developments, Glitchtrap Vanny, the construction of the Mega Pizzaplex, the events of Security Breach, represent a new generation of this story operating in the aftermath of everything Michael's generation experienced and addressed. This is itself meaningful when you're trying to understand Michael's complete legacy, because the story doesn't require his continued presence to demonstrate that his actions had lasting effects. The world the subsequent games inhabit is different from the world that preceded Pizzeria Simulator precisely because of what Michael and Henry did within it. Vanessa, the young woman who becomes entangled with Glitchtrap's influence and eventually operates under the masked identity Vanny, is inheriting consequences she has no meaningful framework for understanding. She encounters the remnant of William Afton, in whatever form that remnant actually takes within the VR experience's code, without any of the family history and direct knowledge that allowed Michael to understand what he was dealing with when he descended into Circus Baby's entertainment and rental. She lacks Michael's specific, costly education in what this particular consciousness is capable of, and what it costs to engage with it directly. The result is that Glitchtrap's influence takes hold of her in a way that Michael, with his particular background, might have recognized and resisted, though speculating about how Michael would have handled Vanessa's situation requires acknowledging, honestly, that this is extrapolation beyond what the material confirms. Security Breach introduces Gregory, trapped overnight in the Mega Pizzaplex and finding an unexpected ally in Glamrock Freddy, and the contrast between Gregory's situation and Michael's is one that attentive viewers of this franchise's complete arc will notice without necessarily being able to articulate immediately. Michael entered Circus Baby's entertainment and rental as an adult, with deliberate intent, with specific knowledge of what he was looking for and why, and with years of guilt-driven preparation behind him. Gregory enters the Pizzaplex as a child, accidentally, without meaningful preparation, and survives primarily through the specific relationship he develops with an animatronic protector rather than through any prior understanding of the history embedded in the space around him. This doesn't make Gregory's experience less significant or less real within the franchise's terms, but it places it in a different category from Michael's experience, one that emphasizes the continuing cost of the history Michael's generation failed to fully resolve, rather than representing a genuine new chapter building on resolved foundations. The Pizzaplex exists because Fazbear Entertainment survived and rebuilt and rebranded, continuing the operational pattern that William Afton's partnership with Henry originally established, and the fact that it's still capable of producing the kind of overnight horror Gregory experiences suggests that what Michael and Henry accomplished, significant as it was, didn't address every layer of what was wrong with this particular world. Vanny stalking the Pizzaplex's corridors under Glitchtrap's influence, Burntrap waiting in the facility's hidden lower levels, representing some physical reconstitution of Afton's damaged remains that should, by this point, have nothing left to reconstitute. These developments demonstrate that the persistence the franchise has always attributed to William Afton extended even beyond the fire at Pizzeria Simulator in ways that Henry's plan, however carefully constructed, didn't fully account for. Michael gave everything he had to finishing this, and the finish didn't hold completely, which is perhaps the most genuinely tragic dimension of his entire story. Not that he failed dramatically, but that he succeeded sufficiently to change the situation without being able to change it entirely. The Ruin expansion and Cassidy's investigation of the Pizzaplex's aftermath adds one final significant layer to this overall picture. Cassidy, confirmed as the spirit connected to Golden Freddy, one of the original 5 children murdered at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, conducting an investigation of the ruins a year after security breaches events, represents the franchise's acknowledgement that certain threads from Michael's era of this story haven't concluded as cleanly as the Pizzeria Simulator fire might have suggested. The original 5 children, whose rest within the Fazbear's Fright true ending seemed to represent a genuine conclusion to their portion of this narrative, apparently have continued relevance to what comes after, informs the franchise is still in the process of fully articulating. What does this mean for Michael's legacy specifically? It means that the story he dedicated his adult life to isn't a story that concluded neatly when he stepped back from it. It's a story that he moved significantly forward, at enormous personal cost, in ways that changed what was possible for every subsequent person who encountered this world, without being able to bring it to the kind of absolute, permanent closure that would make the subsequent suffering unnecessary. This is, on one level, simply honest. Stories of this kind, rooted in damage caused and consequences managed rather than fully resolved, rarely arrive at the clean ending participants within them might hope for. Michael's contribution to this narrative wasn't a solution. It was a meaningful intervention in an ongoing problem, and the ongoing nature of the problem doesn't retroactively diminish what the intervention accomplished. Let's pull everything together now, because Michael Afton's complete story, traced from a childhood at Fredbear's Family Diner to the fire at Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, deserves to be seen as a whole rather than as a series of individual events whose connection to each other becomes clear. Respect. He begins as a child in a difficult household, one shaped by a father whose relationship with his own work has always been colder and more consuming than anyone around him fully recognized. He becomes choices he made child, directly responsible for his brother's death. He spends his adult life carrying that responsibility in the specific form that guilt takes when it can't be discharged through ordinary means, because you broke can't simply be repaired, only accounted for in whatever way remaining life permits. He loses his sister to his father's technology. He watches his father continue building and continuing operating within a world that repeatedly fails to hold him accountable for what he's done to the people closest to him. He descends into an underground facility looking for his father and loses his body to the entity assembled from his sister's animatronic remains. He survives this in a form that marks him permanently, that makes ordinary life in the ordinary world essentially inaccessible to him, that reduces his available options to continuing the mission that brought him underground in the first place or stopping entirely, and he chooses to continue. He finds his father, eventually, in the most diminished, deteriorated form that survival across spring lock failure and multiple fires and decades of mechanical decay can produce, and he does what he set out to do, which is not to punish him, but to gather everything his father's history produced into one space where it can be definitively addressed by someone who understands it completely enough to ensure that the addressing actually takes. He works alongside Henry Emily, the man whose grief mirrors his own in certain ways while being rooted in entirely different soil, and together they arrange the specific conclusion that neither of them could have managed alone. And then the story continues without him, because stories like this don't stop when the people most essential to them step back. The damage William Afton caused across his lifetime was distributed too widely, embedded too deeply in the technology and the institutions and the specific supernatural logic of this universe, to be fully addressed by any single intervention, however significant and however costly. Michael closed chapters. He didn't close the book. The chapters that follow in security breach and ruin and into the pit, and whatever comes next, are happening in a world fundamentally shaped by what Michael did, even though Michael himself is absent from them in any documented form. This is, ultimately, what his legacy actually consists of. Not a heroic resolution that tied everything together and left the world better in some clear, measurable sense. Not a clean redemption arc that balanced the scales between what he did at Fredbear's Family Diner and what he spent his subsequent life attempting to address, but something considerably more honest than either of those options. A person who, within the specific consequences of his own choices and his father's choices without escaping them, who moved toward the center of exactly the damage he helped cause rather than away from it, and who paid in ways that accumulated across years and included his own body and his own ordinary life, and finally his own presence within the ongoing story, for the specific, meaningful differences his choices made to the people and presences he encountered along the way. The 5 children from the original restaurant found rest. Elizabeth's spirit, whatever complicated form it occupied within Circus Baby and later Scrap Baby, was included in the release Henry's fire produced. Charlie, the first victim in this entire timeline, the death that started everything, received the acknowledgement and the conclusion her father had been working toward for decades. These things happened because Michael Afton chose, at every point where a different choice was available to him, to continue moving toward the source of the damage rather than away from it. There's a particular kind of heroism that doesn't look like heroism when you're inside it, that presents itself as simply the only remaining option for someone who takes seriously the question of what their choices cost other people, and what, if anything, can be done about that cost. Michael Afton was never a hero in any uncomplicated sense. He was first a cruel child, then a guilty survivor, then a damaged adult operating in circumstances that would have ended most people considerably earlier than they ended him, in pursuit of an objective he understood clear enough to know that achieving it might not leave much of him behind on the other side. He was right about that, and he went anyway, which is either the definition of something genuinely admirable, or the definition of someone who ran out of any remaining reason to protect himself from the specific direction his guilt kept pointing him toward. The franchise doesn't tell you which of those readings is correct, and the honest answer is that both of them are, simultaneously. Because that's what complicated people doing significant things in impossible situations actually look like when you trace their complete story from beginning to end, without simplifying it into something more comfortable. What remains of Michael Afton, after the fire and the silence and the subsequent generations of people navigating the world his actions helped produce, is exactly this: the specific shape his choices left in the events around them. A younger brother who died but whose spirit eventually found rest, in part because of the chain of events Michael's guilt set in motion. A sister who died inside machinery their fathered, but who was included in the conclusion that Michael helped arrange. A father who damaged everything he touched but who was finally, genuinely finished within a fire Michael helped prepare, and a world that continues carrying the consequences of William Afton's choices, as worlds always do with damage this deeply embedded, but that carries them in a fundamentally different configuration than it would have if Michael Afton had made the easier choice available to him at every decision point across his adult life, which was simply to stop. He didn't stop. That's the entire story, that's the legacy. For someone who began his documented history holding his little brother's head against a spring-locked mascot suit's open jaws on a birthday that should have been ordinary, not stopping, continuing in the direction of accountability rather than escape, is not a small thing. It's actually, if you hold the complete arc at sufficient distance to see its full shape, the most significant thing that any character in this franchise manages to accomplish across its entire accumulated history. Not because it solved everything, not because it left the world clean and the damage fully addressed and every spirit at rest and every consequence resolved, but because it demonstrated, through the specific and costly choices of one person across one deeply complicated life, that the direction a person in after doing something they can't take back matters, even when the moving is painful, and even when the destination isn't certain, and even when what you find at the end of the search doesn't resemble you might have imagined when you started. Michael Afton spent his life moving in the right direction. That's enough. That's more than enough. That, in the end, is everything.